We used to have some old family friends. They were Mr. and Mrs. Darling, and they lived in eastern Ontario, sort of near Cobourg, and we got to know them when we lived in the same community, and we became very close friends. And then when I was a boy, we moved away to another community, but we stayed in touch with Mr. and Mrs. Darling. And sometimes when we would be back in that part of the province, we would go and stay with them. And Mr. and Mrs. Darling lived in a really old house that had what I thought was a really unusual design. There was a really big kitchen area at the back of the house, and when you went there, you would pull up on the driveway beside the house, and you would kind of go in at the back corner, and you'd walk into this big kitchen area. And they had a very nice formal sitting room in the front of the house. But also the kitchen at the back was so big that they had actually put some more comfortable couches and chairs sort of in a corner of the kitchen, and they would sort of hang out in that part of the kitchen. And I don't know where all the bedrooms were, I can't remember exactly, but the master bedroom also was just off the kitchen. And I remember when we would go and visit them and maybe stay the night, we would stay in the guest room. And also at the back corner of the kitchen, there was kind of a tiny little stairway which led up to what was kind of an attic. And we would sleep in this kind of converted attic bedroom right above the kitchen. And I remember one time we were staying there, and I remarked to my mom, I said, "This is kind of an unusual house, don't you think?" And she answered in a very different way. She said, "There's a lot of love in this house." Now, we were talking about different qualities of the house. I was talking about the layout, and she was talking about the love of the people that lived in it. And it's true. There was a lot of love in that house. And there was a lot of love in that house because Mr. and Mrs. Darling were loving people. And they were loving people because they had an amazingly deep faith in God that just oozed love out of their pores. There was a lot of love in their house, and it was a very good place to be. I think a good place to live is in many ways what we human beings have sought since the beginning of time. The book of Genesis tells a story about the first people who were called Adam and Eve, and at the beginning of creation, they were sort of running around naked in a tropical paradise. And then when they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, all of a sudden they knew that they were exposed. And of course, they would have had to find clothing. And then they would have had to build themselves suitable shelter to keep out the wind and the rain and the cold. One of the early characters in the Bible is Abraham. Abraham and his family were probably nomads. They would have traveled around at different times of the year to find pasture for their animals. And one of the very early parts of the biblical story is when God reaches out to Abraham and promises to him and to all his descendants a land of their own. And what a land of their own would mean is that they would be able to stay settled. And rather than moving around and having to live in tents, they would be able to build permanent houses. And they would be able to live settled lives. In many ways, the story of Israel in the Bible is the long story of the quest of their people to live in peace and security in the land that God had given them, so they could live comfortable lives, stationary lives, in relatively nice homes. I think very much that this remains the case for us. I think perhaps of our ancestors, those of us who had parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents who came to this country, maybe from Europe, and they arrived here and they encountered virgin forest. And they would have had to have the incredible task, the difficult job of clearing the land, and not just cutting down the trees, but then having to pull out the stumps and to build cabins out of the trees that they had cut down. Must have been an incredibly difficult life, especially in the first winter that they were here. And can you imagine the difficulty of such an existence? And can you imagine the tremendous motivation that our ancestors would have needed to travel such a long way from the place of their birth and to go to such trouble just so that they could have some land of their own and the opportunity to build a nice house to live in? For us today, we sometimes say that our homes are our castles. And this is true on many levels. Many of us live in relative luxury. And more than that, we use our comfortable homes as places of retreat where we find rest and safety and security from the world. A few years ago, IKEA came out with a slogan. It said, "Home is the most important place in the world." Not so long ago, a big Canadian media company did a survey to find out who were the most trusted Canadians. And number 2 on the list was a home building contractor named Mike Holmes. He works on houses and gives people better places, nicer, more comfortable places to live. And he is the second most trusted person in our country. It's a true story. A couple of years ago, my parents were looking to put in a new kitchen at our cottage. And they were told that there was a good kitchen guy at the Home Hardware in Georgetown. And so on the way up north one day, they stopped at the Home Hardware in Georgetown, and they ran into Mike Holmes. And apparently my mom almost fell over with excitement. My dad said she was giddy as a schoolgirl to run into a building contractor. We love our homes. We want to have nice places to live in. And I think in many ways, the long history of our faith in God is based on the idea that if we have nice places to live in, then God also wants a nice place to live. As soon as the Hebrew people were led out of slavery in Egypt and they began wandering in the wilderness, they had what was called the tent of meeting. Not only did they have the temporary portable shelters for themselves to live in, they also set up a tent where they could go to worship. And inside the tent of meeting was what they called the Ark of the Covenant, which was an elaborate chest which held the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments. And they felt that inside the tent of meeting and surrounding the Ark of the Covenant was the presence of God with them. When they were still wandering in the wilderness, but had become a little bit more settled, they built an even more elaborate worship structure known as the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was a much larger and more elaborate tent. The Old Testament tells us that it was built out of not just wood and stone, but leather and beautiful linens and precious metals like gold and silver and valuable gemstones. And the people of Israel believed that the presence of God was found within the tabernacle. Though they were living a harsh, nomadic desert existence, God needed a nice place to live. When eventually Israel was settled in their promised land, and they had attained some level of security and wealth under King Solomon, there was built a permanent temple, a permanent structure for worship that housed the presence and the glory of God. In the 6th century BC, the Babylonian Empire came along and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. But as soon as they could, some 60 years later, the exiles of Israel returned to their land, and under the leadership of an administrator called Nehemiah, made as their first priority to rebuild the temple so that the presence and glory of God would be in their midst. And that so-called Second Temple remained until the time of Jesus and a few short decades after his life. And the Second Temple was the center of religious life for the people of Israel. At the center of the temple was a space known as the Holy of Holies. And it was in that small space that the presence of glory of God was thought to live. And only one person, the high priest, was even allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, and then only on one day a year. It was sacred, holy ground. And even more than that, it was a center of national life, the focus of people's outlook. They say that the Second Temple was an incredibly grand and marvelous structure, the most impressive building that anyone could see in antiquity for hundreds of miles in any direction. All because God needed a nice place to live. We have continued that tradition in Christianity in many ways. Our ancestors who came to this country had as their first task to build themselves some log cabins. And as soon as they could, they built nicer cabins. But they also built incredibly grand churches such as this one. Churches where they could gather in the name of God to experience God's presence and to worship. Places where they could gather as a community. I read recently in the book of one historian who was writing on religion in 19th century Ontario, even said that the presence of a grand church like this one could raise the property values of all the business owners and homeowners in a community. Now, in some ways, today we have gone in the opposite direction, thinking that God is never contained, that God is always and equally everywhere at the same time. There was an American comedian who had a character called Father Guido Sarducci. And he had this wonderful routine where he talked about starting something called the 5-minute university. And he said the curriculum in the 5-minute university was consist only of what someone would actually remember 5 years after graduating from a normal university. So he said there was going to be a Spanish course. And in the Spanish course, you would learn this. You would learn how to say, ¿Cómo está?, which means, how are you? And then you would learn how to say, muy bien, which means very well. And that would be it. Because he said, if you went to university and took a semester of Spanish, 5 years later, that's all you would remember. And he said at the 5-minute university, there was also going to be a theology department. And this is what you would learn in the theology department. You would learn to ask, where is God? And then you would learn to answer, everywhere. Then you would learn to ask, why? And then you would learn to answer, because he likes you. We like to think of God as everywhere. Now, in truth, it is rather an imprecise theological statement to say that God is everywhere. I don't think it's very meaningful to say that God, for instance, would be in that wooden pew or in my leather watch strap. Rather, what we want to say is that God is always nearby to us. And even more than that God longs to be in the midst of humankind. Where there are people, God wants to live. The Apostle Paul said it this way in one of his letters. He said, "Do you not know that you are a temple for God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in your midst?" When he said, "Do you not know," he was talking in the plural. He was saying, y'all are a temple of God, and God lives among you. The Apostle Peter said it this way in the reading we heard a few minutes ago. He said, Jesus is like a cornerstone or a foundation, and you are like living stones. And when you are built on the foundation of Jesus, you become a holy temple. And in your midst are made spiritual sacrifices to God. This is one of the most beautiful and powerful images for me of the Christian church in the New Testament. We are told that the church is a building. But the church is not a literal building like this one. It is not made out of bricks and stone. It is a figurative one made out of you and me. It was established on the foundation of Jesus, who was perfectly faithful to God and perfectly loving to others. And when we become like Jesus in our faithfulness and in our love, we become in connection with one another the bricks and the stones which make up the house in which God chooses to live. This is why, for example, Charles Wesley could write in his famous hymn, "Love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down. Fix in us thy humble dwelling, and all thy faithful mercies crown." Part of the good news of our faith is not just that God wants to live in our midst as a people. And not just even that God is already among us, but that God promises in the future to be among us in absolute and total fullness. Right at the very end of the Bible, towards the conclusion of Revelation, John, who was having the vision which was recorded in that book, looked and he said he saw a vision of heaven coming to earth. And he said, "See, the home of God is among humankind." God will live in our midst, and we will be God's people. And it will be the culmination of the whole history of the story of creation. This is why a modern hymn writer called Marty Haugen could say, "Let us build a house where love can dwell." For when we are formed into a house where love can dwell, we will be in a house that is full of love. And it will be full of love because we will be a faithful people and God will be in our midst. And it will be a very, very good place to be. Our next song together is hymn number 332.